Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I am a historical linguist, or by some standards, philologist, much as J.R.R. Tolkien was. And much like J.R.R. Tolkien, my primary academic interest is in ancient Germanic languages, although I focus a little more on Old Norse and he a little bit more on Old English. Still, based on that concurrence of interest and the fact that I hadn't read Lord of the Rings in my adulthood, or ever really attentively before that, I have been reading The Lord of the Rings, going through and making my remarks, just whatever occurs to me, either as an Old Norse person or sometimes just as a reader. So in this video, I'm going to wrap up the last bit of the Fellowship of the Ring, the last 4 chapters thereof, because I was doing 3 chapters at a time without realizing that that would strand 1 chapter at the end here, and rather than do that, I just did the 4th. So, ending the Fellowship of the Ring in this installment. So, there wasn't as much to talk about here as there were. Like in the last installment, there was a lot to talk about because there were all the dwarf names that were Old Norse. In this chapter, in these chapters, as we get into mostly Lothlórien, and then the places they go after that on the river, there just isn't as much, except just a really remarkably large amount of archaic vocabulary. Some of this is archaic vocabulary that I recognize from, say, Old English or Old Norse. Some of it, stuff I don't like. Stuff that mystifies me, right? I mean, like, and I'm a old language person, but I think that's really kind of part of the charm of Tolkien, is that he writes as if you understand everything that he says, even though plainly not everybody who reads it, including me, does. I don't know without looking it up, you don't have to tell me what these things mean. I can use a dictionary too. What a fosse, F-O-S-S-E, is, for example. I know what a fosse without the E at the end is. I thought that it was interesting that while they were in Lothlórien, we see a lot about flets, right? A flet is a floor. That word is used in Old Norse for the floor of a house too, and occurs in, for example, in Havamal. We're warned in the very first stanza of that poem of wisdom that we should beware enemies who might be on on the floor before us. But I thought that it was interesting that to Frodo it seemed as if, quote, on it was built a house so large that almost it would have served for a hall of men upon the earth, off quote. I thought, are they not on the earth, right? Does Lothlórien not quite count? Is Lothlórien like another realm? Is this like is this the Middle Earth equivalent of, they're in Oldhammer or something like that? They're no longer in Midgardr or Middle Earth. I don't know. I thought this was still Earth, but that was something that gave me a little bit of pause. We also had our first hints here that Aragorn is old, certainly older than he looks like he is, because he remembers coming to Lothlórien 8 and 30 years before this, and and obviously he was an adult in the context of that previous visit, so he's clearly much older than he seems to be. I thought there was an interesting linguistic thing going on with everybody talking about how Gandalf has, quote-unquote, fallen. He, quote, fell. We know if we've seen the movies or read the book before that he's not dead, but it seems like maybe Tolkien is trying to sort of cheat around that a little bit and hint to us that he's not dead, that, everybody says he fell. He doesn't want someone to say that he died. But clearly, I think reading this the first time, I would have assumed Gandalf was dead. I just think that it's interesting that the word die is not used there. It was in this chapter, as we talk about elves so much, that I really thought that it was noticeable, the spelling of, Elvish with a V, Elven with a V, elves, plural, with a V. Of course, part of what Tolkien was doing with that, which wasn't standard in English when he first published this in the 1950s, same thing with dwarvish, dwarven, dwarves with V's, is he was analogizing these words to words in English like knife, knives, wife, wives, where what's happened in English is in Old English, that F at the end of a word, at the end of a word finally, like in weef, woman, or knief, knife, although that word is ultimately borrowed from Old Norse. That's an F sound, but it's a V between vowels, like it is in the plural of those words, weevu, wives, women, or presumably knivas, knives, if that plural was borrowed from Old Norse and Old English. So what he's doing is he's taking that F between vowels and making it a V, as if these words had naturally survived in English that way. I don't know whether they did naturally survive that way or not in some dialects, but he wants them to have that archaic morphology, right? My understanding is that early editors actually disliked that and wanted to make it elfin and dwarfs rather than elven and dwarves. But it's clearly something that matters to him as a philologist focused on Old English. Speaking of elves, we see, I believe it's Galadriel who says, quote, "We must depart into the west or dwindle to a rustic folk of dell and cave, slowly to forget and to be forgotten," off quote. I wonder if she's kind of implying that's what's happened to elves in quote-unquote our time, right? Since this is hypothetically a past tense of our world. They've become a rustic folk of dell and cave, those who are left who didn't go to the west. I don't know how much continuity there is with the history of our world here. Surely, sometimes it seems like he thinks that he's writing a history of our world. I thought that it was funny as Chapter 8 started. We have this whole discussion between Galadriel and Frodo at the end of Chapter 7, but then Chapter 8 we start with Celeborn, and I thought, just like when Merry and Pippin suddenly start talking again after they've been in the caves of Moria, it's like, who is that, right? But there's so many characters in this book that sometimes you sort of forget about the ones who don't talk as much. I thought that it was interesting. Celeborn says something about, quote, "Then they may return to their own lands or else go to the long home of those that fall in battle," off quote. Sure sounds a lot like Valhalla, where people who die in battle go in Norse myth. Possibly something similar in pre-Christian English myth, although Valhalla may be a much later idea than that. I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know enough about Elvish theology, but I thought that it was interesting to see a very Valhalla-like concept there. Probably one of the things that struck me the most in this chapter was Gimli encountering Lembas, the magic bread of the elves, for the first time, calls it Crom. And I wondered if that is a word, possibly this is some regional English thing, right? But the first thing that came to my mind was the Old English verb kreman, the past participle of which forms our word crumb, right? Crumb of a cookie or something like that. But I wondered if this is just an oblaut variant on that, right? The past tense is kreman is kram. Kreman is like crumble, fall apart. So I wondered if that was just a word for a cake that Tolkien is making up for the dwarves or for the people in the eastern part of the mountains where the dwarves live and learn their common. An elf talking about the Lembas bread says, quote, "One will keep a traveler on his feet for a day of long labor, even if he be one of the tall men of Minas Tirith," off quote. That made me wonder if elves are supposed to be short, right? Are Aragorn and Boromir taller than elves? I don't know. I mean, just like in real Norse myth, I don't have a very clear picture of what an elf is supposed to be. I keep wondering about that as I read this, trying to kind of shed the movie image or the D&D image from my head and get to what Tolkien has in his mind. And I'm not very sure what physical image I'm supposed to have in my mind for the elves. But this makes it sound like they might be shorter than Aragorn and Boromir. A lot of archaic words here, especially they talk about the magic cloaks. I guess I'm making the mistake that Pippin is and calling it magic because it's made by elves, but come on, it's magic. The elves say that quote, the web is good, off quote. Of course, by web they mean, the weaving, right? Web is related to weave. In Older English, not used just of things that spiders make. And we hear, quote, for she herself, Galadriel, and her maidens wove the stuff, off quote. Of course, stuff sounds like a much more informal word to us in modern English, in contemporary English, where we use it of everything, right? Everything is stuff. But it's used more specifically in an older fashioned register of English to mean material. So, a little bit of that. Speaking of archaic versus contemporary English, when they, quote, pass out and leave the city of the elves, off quote, of course, like, I know what they're saying. They're leaving the city of the elves. They're passing out. They're passing from the inside to the outside. But most contemporary English speakers think one thing when it comes to pass out, and that's, have too much to drink and fall asleep. More really archaic words, hythe, Hythe, if that's even how anyone says that. Greensward. Kind of, I don't know, I really feel like Tolkien is enjoying really throwing these old-fashioned words at us here. A lot of good details about the landscape, though. The sunlight glittering on the water and the golden leaves and the bright and still air as they depart on the river. It was kind of weird when the company starts going down the river, and then Celeborn and Galadriel come toward them in a ship and then say, no, don't leave quite yet. We're going to have a meal with you. And, quote, Frodo ate and drank little, heeding only the beauty of the lady and her voice, off quote. I wondered if that's creepy to Galadriel. But everyone seems to really fixate on looking at her. I mean, I live with a woman that people like to look at, but like I feel like if everyone were, constantly staring at her throughout every meal, the way that people seem to do to Galadriel, I would be bothered. I guess Celeborn's just used to it. We get some Old English looking place names. We hear about the Wetwang. Boy, that sounds different to a modern English speaker, but that's the Wet Plain, and then probably the Ent Wash is meant to be an Old English name, as in the giant or monster wash, water. Of course, it may specifically refer to the Ents, the tree creatures here. There's also the Eisen River, in Old English, Isen River. I wonder if Tolkien himself said it as Isen. That means iron in Old English. Of course, that's cognate with German Eisen. And modern English, iron. The reason we have S variants and R variants, Old Norse has an R variant of that word, jorn, is that, although it also has an S variant, isarn, is that those are Werner's law variants in ancient Germanic languages. I think both the S and the R form are present in Old English as competing forms. Tolkien has taken the S form here, probably for the sake of old stuff. I thought that we had a little bit of a philologist's fantasy here when Celeborn says, quote, do not despise the lore that has come down from distant years, for oft it may chance that old wives keep in memory word of things that once were needful for the wise to know, off quote. And of course, all of us with PhDs and things like this wish that our knowledge of old lore would prove needful to other people. I wondered at Galadriel having maidens, because I thought, elves live thousands of years. How old would an elven maiden be, right? I mean, it seems like it's interesting. I never quite knew who the Lothlórien were. I don't feel like Tolkien explained that. Of course, maybe he doesn't want to. Saw more emeralds coming through here. We have this gift left by Arwen for Aragorn, and here I found out that apparently Arwen is Galadriel's granddaughter. I had not realized that, but I guess it makes sense. Given the lifespans and immortality of the elves. Of course, there's the charming scene where Gimli says there's nothing he wants except a single strand of Galadriel's hair. He says, quote, unless it be permitted to ask, nay, to name a single strand of your hair, off quote. I thought that was a somewhat archaic use of name. Right, he's distinguishing, actually asking for, actually requesting this from just simply naming its existence, stating that a hair exists. I thought that was possibly a little bit archaic. I wondered about it when Gimli then said that it would be, quote, an heirloom of my house, off quote, because I thought, does Gimli have kids? Do dwarves at all have kids? It's something that's a little bit unclear in Tolkien's work to me so far, although I remember there's some joke about this in the extended edition movie of the Two Towers, but do dwarves have kids? I mean, they talk about son of, sure, but are they dwarf women? I don't know. It's not very clear in Norse myth, and I don't feel like it's super clear in Tolkien either. In Norse myth, the dwarves originate, according to Snorri in the Prose Edda, as the maggots that grow in the body of Ymir, the original living being. I think actually Gimli makes a joke about that in the extended edition movie of the Two Towers. I don't know if that's actually part of Tolkien's lore or not. Maybe that'll be later in The Lord of the Rings. Galadriel sings a song in, I think, Quenya, as the Fellowship is actually finally leaving, and Frodo, even though he doesn't understand it, somehow remembers it years later. I thought that was surprising. I thought it was surprising that his translation of it was not metrical. I figured that Tolkien would be a stickler about that, but he provides a prose translation of it. I thought that it was surprising that Tolkien used the phrase, quote, like gold, fall the leaves in the wind, off quote. I would have figured him for a stickler about saying as gold. Some writers are sticklers about that even in 2024, so that surprised me. A lot of deep lore here about, the refuge across the sea and Varda. I mean, I remember some of that distantly from reading the Silmarillion a million years ago, but obviously for a first-time reader of The Lord of the Rings, the stuff has got to be kind of impenetrable, but it provides a lot of color. Tolkien does his world building really well. I thought there's some unnecessary foreshadowing here, right? Quote, to that fair land Frodo never came again. I mean, like, I don't know, Tolkien. Like, you can leave us wondering. And I thought there was actually a pretty interesting discussion between Gimli and Legolas about memory and how it works for elves versus dwarves. Gimli says, quote, memory is not what the heart desires. That is only a mirror, be it as clear as Heled Zaram. Off quote. I thought that was nice, and of course, Legolas has an interesting explanation about how, or rather, Gimli says to Legolas, quote, I have heard that for them elves, memory is more like to the waking world than to a dream. Off quote. Well, now that's an elvish superpower. If their memories actually feel like experiences they're having in the moment. Anyway. Let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll come back and wrap up the Fellowship of the Ring with you. All right, again, not a ton to talk about with chapters 9 and 10 relative to some of the previous chapters. Some archaic words, meads for meadows, something that no living speaker of English that I know of would say, but Tolkien is quite content to, even pages after using mead to mean a drink. I thought there was an odd feature here in chapter 9, the Great River, where he's heavily trying to hint that Boromir is having dark thoughts about taking the ring and things like that. But we never get inside of his head, even though we get to get inside of the head of just about every other member of the company, right? We hear what Legolas is thinking, right? Quote, the heart of Legolas was running under the stars of a summer night in some northern glade, etc., off quote. We don't hear the stuff about Boromir, so I think I feel like even as a first-time reader, I would kind of get the hint that Boromir is going to do something bad. We hear about Gollum following the company. He seems to be implied to have webbed feet, which is not an image that I had from the movie. We have another archaic word, Eyot, E-Y-O-T. Boy, that's a word that one does not encounter much. I liked some of the interesting archaic vocabulary. Wind-writhen furs, W-R-I-T-H-E-N. Of course, a past participle to writhe as a transitive strong verb is kind of cool. Without having studied Sindarin, I wondered if Irch, which Legolas says when he's talking about elves, is a I mutation plural of orc. that would then parallel like Old Norse sonr, plural sunir, that O to Y mutation plural would be kind of similar. I wonder if that's how it works in Sindarin without reading a grammar of Sindarin. Aragorn talks about yestereve, which strikes me as understandable but kind of weirdly archaic for most speakers of English. I wondered if Tind Rock is supposed to be the summit rock. Old Norse Tindr, modern Icelandic Tindur, is a summit. So I wondered if that's what it's supposed to be. It certainly seemed like it was a summit. And I wondered what master means in the language of the Lord of the Rings, right? We hear about Master Samwise. I mean, looking ahead, there's a chapter called The Choices of Master Samwise, right? But Gimli addresses Boromir in this chapter as Master Boromir. And I just wondered what is master supposed to imply here? Is it just free man? Is it the precedent to Mister, right? Just a distancing, honorific way of talking about someone. Does it correspond to some title in this universe? Are they using it the way that my mom uses it, which is surely ahistorical? She thinks that it's what you call unmarried men, and Mister is what you use for married men. I have no idea where she got that. Maybe that is something someone used to do. No idea. We hear about Thrawn trees, Thrawn, pretty old. I wondered about it when Aragorn says, quote, "My heart yearns for Minas Anor and the walls of my own city," off quote. Did he ever live there? I thought he lived in the north all the time. I know that he's sort of ancestrally from there, or ancestrally from the kings of there and the Northern Kingdom, but I don't know. I guess I'm ancestrally from Scotland, but my heart doesn't yearn for it or ever call it, my own land. I have no claim to Scotland. No one in Scotland cares who I am, and it's like, welcome home, son, when I come back, right? I don't know if that. Of course, I'm not the king, but it's a weird. Just struck me as weird for him to long for a place that I don't think he lived in, but of course I don't know his entire history. At the beginning of chapter 10, Frodo asks Aragorn when he's awake, unexpectedly, quote, "Why are you waking?" off quote. That's some archaic English, because in modern English it sounds like, why are you getting up, right? Why are you becoming awake? In older English, that it can be used for why are you awake, right? Just in the state of being awake. By the way, when he says just after that, quote, "It is not your watch. Your watch is when you are awake." Watch is related to wake. It's the time that you are awake. In Old Norse, vaka might actually, it may be that vak that we see in Old Norse is the source of English wake and waken. I'd hate to say for sure. Watch is surely from Old English, because that cha would only come from Old English. At any rate, wake and watch are definitely from the same root. Boromir says at some point when he's bothering Frodo, quote, "I am a true man, neither thief nor tracker," off quote. Seems like an unnecessary burn on Aragorn. Are trackers not real men? I would have thought they counted. We see this place on Amon Hen described as having, quote, it's quote, "paved with mighty flags," off quote. Of course, I think most people would think flag as in something waving in the breeze like a banner, but surely talking about flagstones. We also see, as Frodo gets his view over the whole wide world, he sees men in, quote, wains, W-A-I-N-S, just an archaic word for wagon. In fact, I believe it's the native English word for wagon, and that wagon is the Old Norse cognate has been borrowed into English and become the more normal word. And then the fellowship starts to break up with Frodo and Sam leaving. Surely the chapter 1 of the Two Towers will finish off the rest of that story, which is in the movie The Fellowship of the Ring. But that will have to wait for next time in this book series. I might do some kind of Patreon Zoom meetup or something to talk about the Fellowship of the Ring. That might be sort of fun for folks just to get together and share thoughts about it. Before that, it's possible that I'll start getting into the Two Towers. Sort of depends on how things go over the next few days. I have no doubt that people feel like my volume is terrible. That's always the case. It's probably worse right now because I have passed out of, I'm using very Tolkienian language here deliberately, I have passed out of the shade of the fishbone that was in my throat. But now I have a new problem because I have an abscess in my jaw that is like blindingly painful. So soon it looks like I'll probably have surgery to treat that, and God knows how long, and that'll also make it hurt to talk and everything else. So just lots of oral problems right now. We'll see how that affects YouTube and other productive activities. But anyway, I appreciate you folks' support. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving who celebrates. If you're doing your Christmas shopping, remember that there is an Amazon shop where your purchases hypothetically benefit me a small amount. Amazon.com/shop/Jackson Crawford. That's money that turns around and helps the channel. That tiny percentage of those purchases that apparently comes back to me. I'm not really sure how it works yet. I also have signed books available from the Boulder Bookstore. If you feel like someone might like a signed book, you can order books signed from there. And I guess you could look at the Great Courses thing. It doesn't exactly benefit me much, but some people like it. And anyway, appreciate you folks taking the classes out there, the Old Norse language classes, the myth class, and supporting the channel on Patreon. And for now, from beautiful Wyoming, please know I'm wishing you all the best. What are you saying?
I think it's terrifying getting up here.
But worth it. Maybe.
It is scary.